In 1923, an entire American city vanished from the map, not just because it was destroyed, but because powerful people wanted it completely forgotten. Welcome to this explainer on the Forgotten Files. Today we're uncovering the unbelievable story of Rosewood, Florida, a town so successful, so thriving, that it became a literal threat to the establishment. What happened next is one of the darkest, most intentionally hidden files in American history. If you love uncovering hidden history, make sure to subscribe. Now, let's dive right in.
So you might be wondering, how does an entire American town just disappear? We aren't simply talking about buildings burning down here. We're talking about an active, coordinated cover-up. We're looking at how a highly successful community was purposely erased from history books and hidden from the public for 67 years. Their survivors were scattered and terrified into silence, and the government essentially just wanted Rosewood forgotten. But to understand why they wanted it hidden, we first have to understand exactly what was lost.
Section 1. A thriving independent community. To really grasp the tragedy here, we have to understand the motive, which academics call racial capitalism. Basically, researchers looking at the early 1900s point out that when Black Americans began finding real economic footholds, they frequently faced severe backlash. This wasn't just mindless rage, It was the deliberate destruction of independent Black economic success to maintain a white supremacist status quo. Rosewood challenged the entire narrative of that era simply by prospering. So just how prosperous was Rosewood? Well, by the early 1920s, while a lot of African Americans in the South were facing crushing poverty, Rosewood was this self-sufficient empire of Black ownership. Families actually owned their land outright. They had a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill, 2 general stores, and they even had their own baseball team, the Rosewood Stars. With 3 churches, a Masonic hall, and these beautiful 2-story painted homes with pianos inside, they were totally defying the era's racial capitalism. They were wealthy, and they were independent. Section 2. The Spark and the Massacre. Now, the historical record presents a pretty stark contrast of what happened next. On January 1st, 1923, in the neighboring white town of Sumner, a 22-year-old white woman named Fannie Taylor claimed a Black man broke into her house and assaulted her. That was the official narrative printed in the white press. But the hidden Black oral history accounts from people who actually worked in her home states a very, very different reality. They reported that a white man had visited Taylor that day, they had a huge fight, and to save her own reputation, she pointed a finger at a Black man. The white mob, well, they didn't wait for an investigation. They just wanted an excuse. What followed was a rapid, coordinated heist of Black wealth and life. Over 7 horrifying days, a mob descended on Rosewood. It started on January 1st when they lynched a local blacksmith named Sam Carter. By January 4th, they attacked the Carrier home. But the residents actually fought back. Sylvester Carrier and others turned their home into a fortress to protect the women and children hiding upstairs, and they ended up killing 2 of the attackers. Enraged, the mob returned the next day, systematically setting homes on fire as families desperately fled into the freezing swamps. By January 7th, every single building in Rosewood, except for 1 white-owned store, was reduced to ash. While the town was actively burning and people were literally being hunted in the swamps, there was this one brief glimmer of humanity. 2 white train conductors, John and Bryce Wright, actually risked their own lives by secretly stopping their train in the dead of night to smuggle women and children out to safety in Gainesville. Without them, the death toll would have been unimaginably higher. Section 3. Erased from the map. 67. I really want you to let the gravity of that number sink in. For 67 years, there was total silence. No textbooks mentioned Rosewood. No documentaries were made. The survivors were so deeply traumatized, so terrified of retaliation, that they didn't even speak the name Rosewood in their own homes. The state of Florida essentially buried the truth in the dirt. And the crazy thing is, this wasn't just some passive forgetting. Just a month after the massacre, an all-white grand jury was convened in Levy County. Even though the killers were literally bragging about what they did in the streets, the grand jury claimed there was insufficient evidence to prosecute a single person. Not one member of that mob was ever charged. The state actively wanted Rosewood erased. Section 4. Breaking the silence. It took over 6 decades until 1982, when a journalist named Gary Moore published a deeply researched article in the St. Petersburg Times. He tracked down survivors and witnesses, and he placed their oral histories side by side with the official records. This was groundbreaking investigative journalism, and it finally brought the story to light. It eventually led to a massive 60 Minutes report in 1983. Finally, the state could no longer hide from its dark history. Now take a look at this document. This is the legal turning point. It's the actual special master's final report from the Florida House of Representatives, dated March 21st, 1994. Prompted by brave survivors like Arnett Goins and Minnie Lee Langley, this document outlines an equitable claim seeking $7.2 million for damages resulting from that 1923 destruction. The survivors and their descendants were finally, officially, demanding justice.
Section 5. Reparations and Remembrance.
This legal battle was a massive uphill climb. At first, Florida tried to block the claims, arguing that a 71-year statute of limitations had passed and all the officials involved were dead. But lawmakers successfully countered that by citing the precedent of displaced Japanese Americans during World War II. The courts had previously ruled that because the government was complicit in their evacuation and property loss, citizens were entitled to compensation completely regardless of how much time had passed. And because local law enforcement in 1923 either aided the Rosewood mob or just stood by idly, Florida was held responsible. Then, in 1994, a huge victory. Florida passed House Bill 591, marking the very first time in U.S. history that a state paid reparations for a racial massacre. While the payout was negotiated down to a $2.1 million package, which awarded $150,000 to each of the 9 living survivors, created a descendant scholarship, and set up a property fund, its true value was absolutely monumental. It forced the state of Florida to officially admit guilt on the public record. And arguably the most important part of that permanent public record, page 4 of the Special Master's report. It officially documents exactly what Rosewood was: a place with a school, churches, a Masonic lodge, and families who owned their own property. By putting this into the state legislature's permanent files, the government ensured that the truth of Rosewood's incredible success and its tragic destruction can never ever be erased from the map again. Before we wrap this up, I want you to listen to these words from Rosewood survivor Roby Morton. She said, "Rosewood was a town where everyone's house was painted. There were roses everywhere you walked. Lovely." It's just so important to rehumanize these statistics, you know? Behind the dry legal documents and the tragic timelines was a beautiful, thriving reality that was violently stolen from families who had built the American dream with their own bare hands. Which leaves us with a really big question. What other forgotten histories remain buried right beneath our feet? The story of Rosewood asks us to consider not just what happened, but why it was hidden. A successful Black community challenged the narrative of the time. It proved they could prosper independently, and that was dangerous to the people in power. So they didn't just destroy Rosewood, they rewrote history to make it disappear. How many other stories were swept under the rug when the truth became inconvenient? It's our job to keep digging. If you're hungry for the real history, the stories they tried to hide, make sure to drop your thoughts in the comments below and join us for our next explainer on the Forgotten Files. See you next time.